1903, an entire Vermont town stopped answering the outside world. Trains passed without stopping, laundry stiffened on the lines for months, and the few who dared enter spoke of figures standing in the streets, silent, holding unlit matches angled north. There are no official records of what happened next. Only a handful of letters, a missing archivist, and one chilling detail that never changes. 3 o'clock in Cold Hearth stopped at exactly 2006. In late October 1903, conductor Samuel Wright guided the evening locomotive through the Vermont hills. His log records a curious event. Train slowed as it passed the town of Cold Hearth. But the station lights were dark. Not a soul waited on the platform. Wright swore he saw laundry frozen on a clothesline, swaying in the wind, yet no movement anywhere. The whistle echoed unanswered. He chalked it up to a late autumn chill. Until a month later, the same thing happened. And again the next. The station agent's door was locked, telegraph line dead. This was no snow-bound absence. This was abandonment in plain sight. The company's route map still listed Cold Hearth as an active stop. The timetable remained unchanged, as though the town had simply decided not to meet the outside world. Wright sent a letter to the central office, suggesting something was amiss. Weeks passed without reply. Then came an instruction: do not attempt to stop. Proceed as scheduled. That winter, rumors began to seep through the railwaymen's quarters. A brakeman swore he saw figures standing at the far end of the street, motionless, watching the train pass. Another claimed the signal lamp flickered once, green, then died. Wright laughed it off over whiskey but kept a private notebook. His last entry from January 1904 read, "We're closer this time." Faces pale, eyes wide. No breath in the air. The entry is dated 3 weeks before Cold Hearth vanished from the company map. Today, no records remain of any official inquiry. The name survives only in weather-worn timbers along the overgrown track, where locals say the wind changes pitch as you pass. This was the first whisper of the anomaly. And for those who dug deeper, was already too late. The archivist's letter, in March of 1904, 3 months after Cold Hearth slipped from the timetable, a junior archivist named Eliza Bell at the Vermont Historical Society opened a battered envelope addressed in a neat, upright hand to whom the record will one day concern. The postmark was December 2, 1903. Cold Hearth, stamped hard enough to bruise the paper. Inside lay a 4-page letter and a pressed sprig of yarrow, already browning at the edges. The author introduced herself as Miss Ada Merrill, schoolmistress, and explained that the town had endured a string of small wrongnesses. She listed them without flourish. A church bell tolling 7 strokes at noon each day despite the rope being cut, butter refusing to churn no matter how long it was worked, the river's current reversing for boy's breadth of time, exceptions that grew more frequent, closer together, until even livestock turned their faces toward the empty tracks at dusk as if awaiting instruction. Ada wrote of the telegraph needles twitching on their own and forming no letters she knew, of pains fogging from the outside in a dry cold, of children complaining that sums refused to add. On the night of November 18, she said, all clocks in town rolled back to 2:06 and refused to advance. She had marked the minute by pricking her thumb and touching the blood to her schoolroom globe. The dot had not dried by morning. Eliza rubbed the page where the blood should have been, feeling only smooth paper. Ada's 3rd page fell into a different cadence, like a practical woman pacing to the edge of a thought she disliked. When she struck a match in her kitchen, the flame leaned toward the north wall. When she doused the lamp, it leaned there still in the dark, a sliver of light in the shape of a match that had already died. The townspeople, Ada wrote, had decided to wait inside at sundown and keep to familiar rooms, as if the walls remembered them better than the streets did. She closed by asking the society to send anyone who could measure what the eye reports yet the mind refuses, then added a line crossed once and left readable. If you arrive late, take no names. Names caught here do not return. Elisa checked the postal ledger for a courier back to Cold Hearth. The line was empty from November onward. That afternoon she requested permission to travel. By morning, request was approved, and the envelope with its withering yarrow had gone missing from her desk. The road to Cold Hearth, Eliza Bell set out before dawn on April 4th in 1904, carrying a leather satchel, her society credentials, and a notebook wrapped in oilskin. She took the morning stage from Montpelier to a small junction where the driver, a man named Latham, regarded her ticket with the same caution one gives to a child holding matches. "No coaches go that way," he said, handing it back. "Roads sound enough till Miller's Bridge, then it don't quite run straight." When Eliza asked if it was washed out, Latham spat into the mud. "Not washed, just wrong." He offered to let her down in the last proper town before Cold Hearth, where she might find a cart or someone reckless enough to take her the rest of the way. She arrived in the hamlet of Brackenford by noon. The innkeeper, Mrs. Howes, did not look surprised when Eliza mentioned her destination. "You'll be walking then," Howes said. "No one here keeps horses for that road. They don't take to it." After a hasty meal of bread and broth, Eliza set off with the sun low at her back, following a rutted track through birch and pine. The first mile passed without incident. The second, she noticed the forest floor was oddly bare. No fallen leaves, no moss, just soil pocked with shallow depressions like footprints worn smooth by rain. In the third, the air thickened, and the usual chorus of sparrows, warblers, and crows fell silent. She paused to make a note but found her watch had stopped, the second hand trembling in place. At Miller's Bridge, a narrow wooden span over a dark stream, she felt a strange resistance as she stepped onto the planks, as if the air ahead had weight. The water beneath ran backward in a steady, deliberate current. She crossed without breathing until her boots met the far bank. Beyond the bridge, the track widened into a street flanked by empty houses. Shutters closed, chimneys cold. Laundry still hung between two porches, stiff as if starched, swaying with the faintest movement, though she felt no wind. Her last note that day was a single sentence: "Cold Hearth is here, yet it waits." As evening shadows lengthened, she sensed shapes behind curtained windows, too still to be alive, too present to be absent. The first door she tried opened easily. The smell inside was neither dust nor rot, but something metallic, like the air before lightning. From somewhere deeper in the house came the faint, steady sound of a match burning in the dark. The house with the matchlight. Eliza stood on the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was perfectly tidy. Chairs pushed in, a folded quilt draped over the settee, an open book resting on a side table. The matchlight, she thought, she saw came from the hallway, an orange sliver trembling along the floorboards as though a flame burned just out of sight. She called, "Hello," but her voice seemed to land heavily, like a stone dropped into sand, without echo. Stepping forward, she noted the air felt warmer here than outside, yet no stove glowed, no hearth smoldered. The hallway smelled faintly of singed linen. She moved toward the light, each step accompanied by the faintest creak. Except one. Halfway down, her right foot came down silent, as though the plank beneath had been replaced by something softer. She crouched, tapped it. It gave a dull, almost hollow reply. The matchlight flickered once, then steadied. At the hallway's end stood a narrow door, the kind that might lead to a pantry or broom closet. The glow leaked from the thin gap at its base. She reached for the knob. It was warm to the touch, unnervingly so. When she opened the door, the light vanished. Not dimmed, but extinguished in an instant. The small space beyond was empty save for a single spent match lying dead center on the floorboards. Its charred tip was still smoking faintly, yet no smell of sulfur rose from it. She bent to pick it up, but her fingers met cold wood. The match was not truly there, only its outline, darker than the surrounding floor, as if burned into memory rather than timber. Behind her, the front door slammed shut with a violent report, though she had left it ajar. She turned sharply. No wind, no movement, nothing disturbed but her own breath. Determined not to be spooked, Liza stepped back into the main room and made a detailed sketch of the match's position in her notebook. She resolved to check the rest of the house before deciding whether to stay. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms waited, each bed neatly made, each window latched, and on every nightstand, the same thing: a glass of water filled to the brim, the surface unbroken and dustless, as if placed there moments before her arrival. She did not drink. By the time she returned downstairs, twilight had thickened outside, and the street beyond the window was no longer empty. Dark shapes stood in the road, facing the house, perfectly still. The watcher, Liza, froze at the window, her breath fogging the glass. The figures, perhaps a dozen, were spaced evenly across the dirt street, all facing the house. They did not shift or sway, though a faint tremor in the air made their outlines waver, as if she were seeing them through heat rising off stone. The failing light revealed only the suggestion of human form: straight backs, heads tilted slightly forward, arms at their sides. Their faces were in shadow, though no hat brims or veils obscured them. She considered opening the window to call out, but a deep instinct, like the one that warns a child not to step too close to the edge, kept her still. Instead, she watched. The longer she stared, the more she noticed each figure's feet were slightly apart, toes angled inward. Their hands, pale and narrow, were clenched as though holding something small and unseen. She blinked, and in that instant, every head lifted in perfect unison, their faces pale ovals, now reflecting what little light remained. She couldn't make out features. No eyes, no mouths. Just the smooth suggestion of where they should be. Her chest tightened. She stepped back from the window, her pulse quickening. The front door handle gave a single, deliberate turn, metal clicking against the latch. She backed toward the staircase, gripping her satchel. The handle turned again, slower this time, then stilled. Outside, the figures had not moved, but the distance between them seemed narrower, as if the gaps had quietly closed. She hurried upstairs, found the smallest bedroom, and positioned herself where she could see both the street and the hall. Darkness settled quickly, the kind without gradient or horizon. One moment the street was dim, the next it was black, and only the vaguest suggestion of the watchers remained. At some point, she must have drifted into a shallow, restless half-sleep, because the next sound startled her upright. A faint hiss, like a match head flaring. A thread of orange light traced itself along the hallway floor outside the bedroom, the same impossible flame she had seen earlier, leaning northward. She held her breath, notebook in hand, and began to count the seconds before it would go out. It never did. Instead, the light grew slowly brighter, and from the street below came a low, rhythmic tapping, as though many hands were drumming softly against the earth in unison. The drumming earth, the tapping swelled into a steady pulse, deep enough that Eliza felt it in her ribs. She crept to the window. The watchers were still there, though now their heads bobbed slightly with each beat, as if following some unheard cadence. The sound wasn't wood or stone. It was soil being struck, a muted thud like knuckles on packed dirt. Every few seconds, the tempo faltered and recovered, never quite mechanical, never fully human. She backed away, forcing her focus to the hallway, where the orange light still clung low to the floor. It seemed thicker now, as if she could scoop it with her hands, and it bent sharply toward the far end of the hall, pointing north like a compass needle fixed on something beyond the walls. She followed it to the door of the smallest upstairs closet. The knob was icy cold, the opposite of the warm pantry latch downstairs. When she opened it, the smell of wet soil rolled out, heavy and fresh, as though the ground itself had been turned moments before. Inside, instead of shelves, the closet held a narrow flight of steps descending into darkness. The matchlight pooled over the first 3 treads before dying into black. Against her better judgment, she took one cautious step down, then another, notebook gripped tight. The air grew cooler, the drumming louder, though muffled as if through thick cloth. At the base of the stairs, she found herself in a small earthen chamber, no bigger than a root cellar. The floor was damp, patterned with circular marks. Dozens of them, each the size of a fist. She knelt to examine one and realized they were indentations left by something striking the ground from below. Before she could measure them, the drumming stopped. Silence hit hard, almost physical. Then came a single knock from directly beneath her boots. She jerked upright, retreating toward the stairs. But before she reached them, something sharp and metallic scraped up through the soil where she'd been kneeling. A match, unburned, pushed slowly into view, its red tip trembling. She did not touch it. Instead, she fled up the steps, slammed the closet door, and pressed her back to it. Outside, the watchers had closed the distance further. Their pale ovals were clearer now, featureless yet somehow expectant, and in the moment before she turned away, she realized every one of them was holding an unlit match in their clenched white hands. The unlit matches. Eliza's throat felt tight, as though the air itself had thickened. From her vantage on the landing, she counted at least 15 figures in the street now, each with their heads slightly bowed, their right hand clutching a match upright toward the sky. The sight pricked some primal nerve in her, an image that did not belong to any rational order of things. She forced herself to turn away, but the image followed her inward like a burn on the retina. She moved to the smallest bedroom again, sat at the desk, and began to write a precise account: the time, the number of figures, the color of their clothing, or the absence of it. It was more like shadows wearing the suggestion of coats, the tilt of their heads. Halfway down the page, her pencil lead snapped, though she hadn't pressed hard. The silence that followed was worse than the drumming. Then came the faint scrape of wood against wood from below, as if a chair were being drawn slowly across a floor in the house's main room. She stood, crossed to the hallway, and peered over the banister. Nothing moved in the parlor, but the front door now stood ajar, letting in the faintest draft. No footsteps sounded on the stairs, yet she felt certain she was no longer alone. A whisper brushed past her left ear, just a thread of sound, but she caught the syllables late, and north. She spun, but only the still hallway met her gaze. She decided she could not spend another night in the house. Gathering her satchel and notebook, She crept down the stairs, each tread groaning except one. The same silent plank from before. The moment her foot touched it, the orange matchlight bloomed along the floor again, streaking toward the north wall, as if to mark her path. The open door gaped ahead. Outside, the watchers parted slightly, creating a narrow passage leading away from the house. Their heads lifted as she stepped onto the porch, the pale ovals turning toward her in eerie unison. None moved closer, but the gap they left seemed to urge her forward, down the street toward the town's far edge. She hesitated only once, glancing back at the house. In the upper window of the smallest bedroom, someone, or something, stood watching her departure, holding a single lit match whose flame bent unnaturally toward the north. The northward path. The watchers held their positions as Eliza walked between them, their featureless faces following her in unison. The dirt underfoot was firm at first, then subtly softened, giving just enough to make each step feel deliberate. She kept her eyes forward, resisting the urge to meet their stares for more than a flicker. The street narrowed into a lane lined with bare, limbed trees. Here, the air grew warmer despite the night, carrying the faint metallic tang she had first smelled inside the house. Somewhere ahead, she heard the low whisper of water flowing. Steady, but with that same odd reversal she had seen at Miller's Bridge. Matches in the watchers, hands never ignited, yet she could feel the latent heat they seemed to promise. The lane emptied into a small clearing, where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. At its center stood a stone marker no taller than her waist, carved roughly with a single arrow pointing north. Beneath it, half buried in the soil, lay dozens of matches. Some burned to the nub, others untouched. As she knelt to examine them, she realized they were planted deliberately, upright in the dirt, their tips all angled in the same northward slant as the carved arrow. A breeze brushed her cheek, warm and dry, and with it came the faint sound of children reciting numbers in unison, a schoolroom chant warped by distance and echo. She scanned the tree line and caught a flash of movement, a figure darting between trunks, smaller than the watchers, quick and deliberate. She stood, the hair on her arms rising. Behind her, the lane was now empty. The watchers had vanished without a trace. In their place, the ground bore a series of fresh indentations. Perfect circles pressed into the earth at even intervals, leading away from the clearing toward the north. She followed them cautiously until she reached the edge of a second, narrower path. There, the air shifted again, denser, almost viscous, and the reversed current of a small stream gurgled over stones. Across the water, just visible in the moonlight, stood a one-room schoolhouse with its door ajar. The sound of recitation grew clearer, not numbers, but the same word repeated over and over, each voice hitting it on the same beat. Late, late, late. Eliza stepped onto the stones to cross, and the water beneath began to flow faster, pulling against her ankles as if reluctant to let her pass. The schoolhouse voices, Eliza reached the far bank with damp boots and a quickened pulse. The schoolhouse loomed ahead, its clapboard walls weathered but intact, open door yawning like an invitation she couldn't quite refuse. The voices inside kept the same rhythm. Late, 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 until she crossed the threshold. Then, silence. The room smelled faintly of chalk and lamp oil. Desks stood in neat rows, each with an open slate and a stick of chalk worn to a nub. A large blackboard spanned the front wall, covered entirely in one word, written hundreds of times Lati. The handwriting varied. Some lines careful and looping, others jagged and hurried, but all bore the same unnerving precision in spacing, as if measured. At the center of the blackboard, the word appeared larger, scrawled in a heavy hand that had pressed the chalk nearly to breaking. Beneath it, a faint smear suggested someone had tried to erase it, but the letters bled through, whiter than before. Eliza moved toward the teacher's desk and found a ledger lying open. The attendance page for November 18, 1903, the date Adam Merrill had described, showed every pupil marked present in looping ink, but the following day's column was blank. The rest of the ledger was empty, no names, no marks, nothing after that date. A faint creak came from the back of the room. She turned sharply. In the corner, facing the wall, stood a small figure, a boy, motionless. His posture was stiff, arms straight at his sides. She called softly, but he did not turn. She stepped closer, her boots loud on the wooden floor. When she was an arm's length away, she saw he held a match in his right hand, its tip angled north. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair lay flat against his head as if damp. "Do you live here?" she asked. Slowly, the boy began to turn his head, but before his face came into view, the air in the room seemed to buckle, the corners of the blackboard curling inward as though pulled by unseen hands. The boy dropped the match, and it did not fall. It hung suspended in the air between them, its red tip smoldering without flame. Then, as abruptly as the silence had fallen, the voices returned, louder now, layered, dozens of them chanting, late, in perfect synchrony. The sound pressed against her skull, and the match began to drift toward the north wall, as if drawn by a current only it could feel. The north wall. The drifting match touched the north wall of the schoolhouse and winked out, leaving a faint scorch no bigger than a coin. The chant stopped mid-syllable, and in the sudden quiet, Eliza became aware of a new sound, a slow, steady tapping from beyond the wall, each beat spaced evenly like a metronome. The boy had vanished. She crossed the room in 3 long strides and ran her hand over the mark. The wood was warm, almost pulsing under her fingertips. Without warning, a thin line began to etch itself downward from the scorch, blackening the boards as if burned from the inside out. It traced a perfect vertical seam, then a horizontal one, until a square about the size of a window was outlined in char. The center of the square bulged inward, then cracked open with a dry snap, revealing a narrow passage sloping down into darkness. From the opening came the same metallic tang she had smelled in the house, and beneath it the faint scent of struck matches. Eliza hesitated only a moment before retrieving her notebook and lantern. The flame flared reluctantly, leaning northward, in that unnatural way she had come to dread. She ducked into the passage. The walls were packed earth, scored with shallow, deliberate grooves that caught the light like writing in an unknown hand. As she descended, the tapping grew louder, joined now by a low hum that vibrated in her chest. The tunnel leveled out into a small chamber lined with shelves. On them sat glass jars, each holding a single match suspended in clear liquid, its red tip still vivid despite the apparent age. Labels in precise ink marked each jar a name, a date, and a time, always ending in 2066. She scanned the shelves and froze. One jar bore her own name, Eliza Bell, April 4, 1904, 206. Match inside floated gently, as if stirred by unseen fingers. Before she could process the sight, a shadow passed across the lantern light. Turning sharply, she found the boy from the classroom standing in the tunnel mouth, his eyes now visible, blank white, reflecting her own lantern back at her. He raised his hand slowly, holding an unlit match, and pointed it toward a second tunnel that sloped even farther north. "Not late yet," he said in a voice that was not entirely his own. "But you will be." The second tunnel. Eliza's grip tightened on the lantern, its light trembling against the earthen walls. The boy's words clung to her. Not late yet, as if they carried the weight of a warning and a verdict at once. The second tunnel yawned ahead, narrower and lower than the first, forcing her to stoop as she stepped past him. He did not follow, only watched, the unlit match steady in his pale hand. The air here was warmer, almost damp, carrying a faint vibration that seemed to hum through the soil itself. Her boots sank slightly into the packed earth, leaving shallow impressions that instantly began to soften, as though the ground was breathing them away. The grooves along the walls were deeper here, curling into spirals and intersecting lines. They reminded her of writing, but in a language meant for something other than eyes. After several yards, the tunnel widened into a vaulted chamber lit from above by no visible source, the light soft and colorless. At its center lay a circular pit, no more than 6 feet across, filled with dark water that rippled without sound. Around the rim, driven upright into the soil, stood dozens of matches. Some pristine, some half burned, each angled toward the north. As she stepped closer, the ripples in the water stilled, and her own reflection rose into unnerving clarity. But it wasn't her as she was. It was her face drained of color, eyes blank like the boy's, lips slightly parted as if mid-word. The reflection's mouth moved, forming shapes she could not hear. Then a match floated up from the depths, bread tip first, breaking the surface without causing a ripple. It hovered at eye level for a breathless moment before turning to point toward the far side of the pit. Eliza followed its direction and saw another tunnel mouth, low and perfectly round, like the burrow of some great animal. The humming in the walls deepened, matching the pace of her heartbeat. She glanced back toward the way she'd come, half expecting the boy to be there. But the passage was empty. From the far tunnel came a single, deliberate knock, the same sound she had heard beneath the root cellar floor. The match dipped once, as if nodding, and began to drift slowly toward that dark opening, its tip still unwaveringly angled north. The third passage. Eliza circled the pit cautiously, keeping her lantern high though its flame quivered with each step. The drifting match moved steadily toward the tunnel mouth opposite her, bobbing faintly as though carried by an invisible current. She hesitated at the edge. Every instinct screamed that this passage was different from the others, older somehow, as if the earth had swallowed it long ago and only recently given it back. The tunnel was perfectly round, its walls packed so smooth they reflected the dim light. The air here was warmer still, with a faint, steady pressure that seemed to push against her chest. She crouched low to enter, one hand brushing the soil as she moved forward. It was dry to the touch, but left a metallic scent on her fingertips. Humming that had filled the second tunnel was deeper now, resonating in her bones, and interwoven with it came a soft ticking, irregular but persistent, like a clock just out of rhythm. She tried to count the gaps between ticks, but found her thoughts slipping, distracted by shapes she thought she saw in the soil. Shapes like eyes closed in sleep, vanishing when she blinked. After perhaps 20 paces, the tunnel began to curve gently, always bending northward. The match ahead kept its pace, neither speeding nor slowing, as if leading her to a precise destination. She considered turning back, but the idea filled her with a sudden, irrational dread. Like retreating would leave something unfinished that could never be corrected. The curve ended in a low archway, beyond which lay a small chamber unlike the others. The floor was of packed earth, yes, but the walls were lined with what looked like wooden boards, until she realized they were doors. Dozens of narrow, human-height doors set flush into the soil, each with a small brass handle and a single word etched into the wood. She moved closer, lantern trembling in her grip. The words were names. Some she recognized from Ada Merrill's letter. Her students, perhaps. Others were unfamiliar. Then her light caught one that made her blood run cold. Eliza Bell. It was positioned near the center, the wood darker than the rest, as though touched by flame. The match hovered before it, its tip trembling now, angled still toward the north, but with a subtle dip, like it was bowing. Behind her, something shifted in the tunnel, a soft scuffing sound that moved closer, unhurried. She turned, but the tunnel was empty. When she faced forward again, her door was open just a fraction, and from within came the faint scent of smoke, and the sound of pages turning in the dark. The door with her name on. Eliza's first thought was that she could close it. Just shut the narrow gap, turn away, and walk back through the tunnels to the surface. But the sound of pages turning reached her again, crisp and deliberate, and with it came a faint whisper, so soft it might have been the scrape of paper. She stepped forward despite herself. The match still hovered, dipping faintly, almost nodding toward the dark slit. She slid her fingertips over the edge of the wood. It was warm, pulsing faintly beneath her skin like the pantry latch in the house. The brass handle felt even warmer, as if someone on the other side had just let go of it. She pushed gently. Door swung open without resistance. Inside lay a narrow space. Too small to be a proper room, more like a cupboard lined with shelves. The lantern light caught dozens of small glass jars identical to the ones she'd seen earlier, each holding a match suspended in liquid, each labeled in the same precise hand. On the lowest shelf, alone in the center, stood one with her name. She lifted it carefully. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, and the match floated tip down, as though pinned there by some unseen weight. Beneath her name on the label was a date she recognized, April 4th, 1904. The day she was blived, but the time just an empty space after 2306. The whisper came again, clearer now. Not yet. She turned sharply. The doorway behind her seemed deeper than before, the tunnel beyond stretching away in impossible perspective, the curve gone. A figure stood at the far end, so still it could have been carved from the earth itself. Its face was featureless, smooth and pale, but in its right hand it held an unlit match. Slowly, it raised the match to its blank face, as if smelling the unburned tip, then lowered it again. The ticking in the walls grew louder, irregular gaps stretching longer, then snapping back into rhythm. She clutched the jar, retreating a step toward the shelves, but the figure did not move closer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, mirroring her own posture, and the match in its hand flared. Without sound, without smoke, burning with a flame that leaned hard to the north. In that light, just for an instant, she saw the featureless face shift into her own. Then the flame winked out, and the figure was gone. The tunnel lay empty, but her jar now bore a single, perfect bead of moisture on the inside, sliding slowly toward the match's red tip. The time mark. Eliza set the jar back on the shelf, her pulse drumming in her ears. The bead of moisture clung stubbornly to the match's tip, as if marking some moment that had not yet come. She wanted to smash the glass, to free the thing inside, but some instinct told her that whatever held the match was not water, and that breaking it might complete something she did not understand. She stepped back into the tunnel, her lantern casting unsteady shadows along the curved walls. The ticking had quieted to a faint, uneven beat, like a clock low on wind. She decided to keep moving. Staying in the chamber with the doors felt like standing among gravestones with her own name carved in one. The match that had guided her was gone, but the air still carried that faint, metallic warmth from the north, and she followed it. The tunnel sloped upward now, the soil firmer under her boots. As she climbed, the grooves in the walls changed from spirals to straight lines, intersecting at sharp angles that formed shapes like incomplete squares. Some of them were charred at the edges, the black marks flaking like old bark. A soft glow began to filter from ahead, pale, steady, and unlike the flickering of her lantern. She extinguished her flame on impulse, and the glow strengthened enough to see the tunnel clearly. It opened into a broad chamber, larger than any she'd entered before, with a domed ceiling and a single object at its center, a great circular table of dark wood, its surface etched with dozens of concentric rings. Around the table stood more of the glass jars, but these were different. Each one embedded directly into the tabletop, their matches angled precisely toward the center. At the very heart of the table lay a shallow depression, and in it, a match stood upright, unburned, its red tip aimed north. She stepped closer, and as she did, a faint movement rippled across the rings, like the table itself was breathing. The match in the center quivered. Every jar around it shifted a fraction, their liquid catching the pale light. Without warning, a deep chime echoed through the chamber. Not a bell's tone, but something older, as though the earth itself had marked an hour. The central match bent slightly toward her, its tip aligning not north, but directly at her chest. From the tunnel behind, the ticking resumed, perfectly matched to her heartbeat. The concentric tabble Elisa froze, the steady beat of the ticking syncing so precisely with her pulse that for a moment, she couldn't tell which belonged to her. The central match remained aimed at her chest, unmoving, while the jars embedded in the tabletop vibrated faintly, producing a high, almost insect-like hum. She leaned in to inspect the concentric rings. They weren't decorative. Each groove was packed with a fine, black powder that shimmered under the pale glow. The lines formed no letters she recognized, but every so often they broke and realigned in the same pattern, a small arrow pointing north. Her hand hovered over the match at the center, and the hum grew louder, as if in warning. She pulled back. As she circled the table, she noticed that each embedded jar had a small brass plate beneath it, etched with a name, date, and time, always. 2006. Some were recent, their dates in the last decade, but others stretched far into the past, as early as 1789. None of the jars bore a blank time except hers. She found it lodged between two others, Elisa Bell, April 4, 1904 to 2. Absence of those last digits felt heavier than any presence could. She reached toward it, but the glass was cool, inert, giving no sign it belonged to her at all. The hum dropped to silence. In its place came a whisper from somewhere above. "Choose your minute." The voice was low, genderless, and it seemed to speak directly into her bones. She craned her neck. Domed ceiling above was no longer smooth. It was a broad, pale surface like stretched canvas, and faint shadows moved across it in looping arcs. One of the shadows bent downward, elongating toward her until it resolved into the shape of a hand. Its fingers impossibly long, each tipped with a red glow like a match head. The hand reached for the central match. Hovering just above it, Elisa's legs tensed to run, but something in the air, the same oppressive weight she'd felt on Miller's Bridge, held her in place. The hand tilted the match back toward its original northward position. In the moment it aligned, a cold gust swept through the chamber, smelling of damp earth and burnt paper. Every jar rattled once, sharply, then stilled. The whisper came again, clearer this time, not yet, but closer. Gah! From the tunnel behind, footsteps began to approach. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. The footsteps. Elisa's first thought was that the boy had returned, but the weight in those approaching steps was heavier, more certain. She stayed beside the table, her eyes darting between the tunnel entrance and the central match, which now stood perfectly still, its red tip unwavering to the north. The pale glow in the chamber dimmed slightly, as if making room for whatever was about to enter. The figure emerged slowly from the dark, a man in a long, dust-colored coat, brim of his hat low enough to shade his eyes. He carried no lantern, yet his face was faintly illuminated, the lines deep and deliberate, like those of a man carved from old wood. In his right hand held an unlit match. In his left, a jar. The jar's label was turned away from her. He stopped just inside the chamber and tilted his head in a gesture that felt halfway between recognition and appraisal. "You've come far," he said, his voice as dry as paper. Elisa swallowed. "What is this place?" The man's gaze flicked to the central match, then back to her. "He ledger," he replied. "Every match, a measure. Every name, a moment." He set the jar gently on the table's outer ring. It slid a few inches on its own, settling into a shallow recess clearly made for it. "Your moment isn't written yet," he added, "but the minute is waiting." Elisa felt her chest tighten. "And if I leave?" He considered this, then tapped the unlit match against his palm. "You'll still be measured. The only choice you have is whether you light it yourself." The hum returned, faint at first, then swelling until it vibrated through the table and up her arms. Around them, the jars began to tremble again, their liquid swirling counterclockwise. The man stepped closer, holding the match out to her. "North is calling," he said. "It always calls. Some go willingly, some are carried." She glanced at the tunnel beyond him, wondering if she could slip past, but his stance blocked it cleanly. And then she noticed. The brass plate under the jar he'd placed was engraved with her name. The date was correct. The time read 2:06. The space was no longer blank. She felt the air around her constrict, pressing the seconds down into something solid. The man leaned in just enough for her to smell the faint tang of burnt paper. "You're almost late," he said. "Shall we finish it?" The strike. Liza's breath came shallow, every part of her resisting the man's offer even as her fingers itched toward the match. The jars rattled harder now, liquid sloshing against glass in uneven surges. She glanced at her own jar, the one he'd just set into the table's groove, and saw the match inside slowly rotating, red tip lifting toward the surface, as though reaching for air. "What happens if I light it?" she asked. The man smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. "Then your time is yours. If not," he let the words hang, tilting his head toward the north wall of the chamber. There, a faint seam had begun to appear, just as in the schoolhouse. The outline of another door, tall and narrow, its edges glowing with the same pale light. She realized with a jolt that it was the only thing in this room aligned exactly north. "And if I refuse entirely?" She pressed. He struck the match against his coat sleeve in one swift motion. It flared without sound, the flame leaning immediately toward the glowing door. "Refusal is just another kind of arrival," he said. The flames light through the concentric rings into sharp relief, each one now crawling with faint, dark shapes. Tiny matches, itched or alive, she couldn't tell. Spiraling endlessly inward, the jars around the table began to hum in harmony, a tone so low she felt it more than heard it. The man extended the burning match toward her. The heat should have been sharp, but it was a deep, steady warmth, almost magnetic. Her hand rose before she realized she'd moved it. "If you light it, the minute is yours," he repeated softly. "If I light it..." His voice trailed, but in that pause, something shifted. The seam in the north wall cracked open a sliver, and she caught the scent of wet soil and struck sulfur. The match in her jerked violently against the glass, its red tip knocking once against the inner wall like a desperate signal. She realized her own heartbeat had locked to the ticking in the walls again, and that each tick brought the jar's match closer to surfacing. The man's eyes fixed on hers, steady and pale. "We have seconds," he said, and for the first time, she thought she heard urgency in his tone. Behind her, from far down the tunnel, came the unmistakable sound of many footsteps approaching, slow, synchronized, and closing in. The door north, the footsteps grew louder, filling the tunnel with a rhythm that pressed at Eliza's back. She stood caught between the man's burning match and the narrow seam in the north wall, which now pulsed faintly, each throb matching the steps behind her. The glow spilling from it was no longer pale. It deepened into an amber hue, like the last light through autumn leaves. The man kept the match steady between them. "Once they arrive," he said, nodding toward the unseen approach, "you won't choose anything." The heat from the flame leaned harder toward the seam, the pull of it almost physical. Eliza's eyes darted to her jar embedded in the table. The match inside now floated just beneath the surface, trembling as if held back by invisible fingers. The liquid swirled counter to the hum of the jars around it. The footsteps turned into a faint, hollow tapping, as though the figures had stepped off earth and onto wood. Her mind flashed to the sound of knuckles drumming soil outside the house, the watchers waiting in the street. A shadow crossed the doorway to the chamber. A tall figure, featureless, with an unlit match upright in its clenched fist. Another followed. Then another. They didn't enter, only stood there, filling the opening like stones in a wall. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "They'll walk you through the door if you let them. You won't come back." The seam in the wall widened a fraction, revealing only darkness beyond, but the air rushing from it was warm and carried that same metallic tang she'd smelled since her arrival. Her chest tightened as she realized the ticking in the walls was now faster than her pulse, pulling her heartbeat into its pace. She looked at the burning match in his hand, then back at the figures blocking the tunnel. The hum rose to a pitch that made her teeth ache. "Choose your minute," the man said again, urgency threading his words. The watchers at the door shifted, their pale ovals tilting toward her in unison, as if to see what she would do. The seam gave another sharp crack, the glow intensifying. She took a step toward the table, her fingers brushing the cool rim of her jar, and felt the liquid inside shiver. Behind her, the footsteps stopped, placed by a silence so complete it roared in her ears. Then one word came from the seam in the wall. Soft, deliberate, "Now." The strike of choice. The word hung in the air, impossibly clear, as if the walls themselves had spoken. Eliza's hand hovered over the man's burning match, the flame leaning so far toward the seam that it seemed moments from extinguishing against the pull. The watchers stood motionless in the tunnel mouth, their pale faces unreadable, each with a match held upright. Red tips angled slightly toward the north. She felt the jar beneath her palm, vibrating harder, match inside knocking repeatedly against the glass in a rhythm that perfectly matched the ticking in the walls. Her breath came shallow and fast, and the hum in the chamber shifted. No longer a single tone, but a layering of voices humming the same note, the pitch bending as if to press her toward decision. "Light it," the man said, his voice steady despite the rising urgency. "Or they will." His eyes flicked toward the seam, which now gaped wide enough for her to see a faint movement inside. Something shifting just out of sight, slow and deliberate. She imagined stepping through, imagined the warmth of the air on the other side. But her mind balked at what might be waiting beyond the threshold. Her pulse surged, and for an instant, the ticking stumbled, a single beat late. The man's expression tightened. "That's your slip," he said. "That's the minute trying to take you." The match in her jar floated upward, broke the liquid's surface without spilling, and hung there weightless, the red tip glowing faintly though no flame touched it. The watchers leaned forward as one, the movement perfectly synchronized. Eliza seized the burning match from the man's hand, the heat blooming against her skin. The instant her fingers closed around it, the humming dropped away, leaving only the ticking. She turned to her jar, intending to press the flame to its match, but the glowing tip inside had turned to point directly at her. From the seam in the wall came a sudden gust, strong enough to make the flame whip sideways. In that moment, she saw the dark beyond spark with dozens of small, leaning flames, each one bending north, each one waiting. The man stepped back, his face unreadable. "Once you choose," he said, "you'll never hear them the same way again." The ticking began to slow, drawing out each second like a breath. She realized the next beat would be hers, or theirs. The minute taken, the next tick never came. It hung in the air like a held breath, and Eliza knew the choice had already begun to close without her. The flame in her hand burned steady, its pull toward the north seam almost unbearable now. The match in her jar hovered at the surface of its liquid. Red tip still pointed directly at her chest, the faint glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The watchers stepped forward into the chamber, their movements utterly silent. Each one raised their unlit match in perfect unison, tips tilting toward her. The man's voice came low. "Once they touch you with theirs, the minute belongs to them." She tightened her grip on the burning match, its heat sinking deep into her fingers, but the idea of pressing it to the glass suddenly felt like sealing herself into that jar forever. The seam in the north wall had widened enough for her to see shapes beyond. Rows of figures in the dim amber light, each holding a match, each flame leaning in the same unyielding direction. The air spilling from it was heavier now, carrying the same scent she had smelled in every wrong place here: a metal, paper, and the faintest trace of smoke. "You can step through and keep your time," the man said, "but you'll never leave the direction it points." The closest watcher reached the table. Its pale, featureless face bent slightly toward her, and it extended its match until the red tip nearly touched her arm. The ticking resumed. One slow, decisive beat. Her jar shuddered. Without giving herself another second to think, she slammed the burning match down against the wood of the table instead of the glass. The flame flared wide, spilling light into every groove of the concentric rings. The hum roared back, deafening, as the jars rattled violently in their recesses. The watchers froze mid-step. The seam in the wall snapped shut with a sound like splitting timber, cutting off the amber glow. When the light died, she was alone in the chamber. The jars were still. The match in hers had sunk back into the liquid, its red tip dim once more, and the plate beneath it remained engraved with her name. But the time after 2006 was still blank. Eliza stepped back toward the tunnel, the silence around her absolute. Somewhere far above, faint but clear, she thought she heard the whistle of a train passing by, not slowing, not stopping.